Composting is a great way to start diverting your organic waste material from landfill in your own homes. It will allow you to process a large proportion of your organic waste materials in a relatively small space. To start, you will need to find a good spot in the garden to set up your compost bin or pile, a spot where the compost will be in direct contact with the soil and it is going to get a good amount of sun throughout the day. Your compost can be made in a specialised compost bin or something handmade like bays, or even just a pile in the corner of the garden, depending on what works best for you and the space you have available. Once you have chosen a spot, you can start setting up your compost. Start with a good drainage layer of sticks or coarse mulch and then start adding a mix of organic material. If you have a compost tumbler, you may wish to start with some manure or soil from the garden to help kickstart the process. To attract only the finest compost critters that will assist in breaking down your organic materials, you'll need to make sure that you are providing a good mix of their favourite foods. This includes brown, carbon-rich materials and green, nitrogen-rich materials. Every time you add a layer of green materials, it is a good idea to add a layer of brown. You may also want to add an activator, like chicken or horse manure, to increase productivity or speed up a slow compost. After you've added your compost materials, what you need to do is provide enough aeration for the compost critters to thrive. Some good ways to do this are using a staff picket or something similar to drive holes through the compost, or a garden fork to break up and aerate the pile. You can also use a compost turner to get the material at the bottom nicely loosened. A good way to remember what your compost will need to thrive is to remember the acronym ADAM: aliveness, diversity, aeration, and moisture. Aliveness refers to the bugs and organisms in your pile. You want to see critters such as beetles, worms, snails, spiders, slaters, and so on. Having your compost pile in contact with the soil is the best way to allow these animals and all the microscopic organisms to get into your compost. Diversity is a reminder to put a good mix of those wet green and dry brown ingredients into your compost in roughly equal measure. Suitable green materials for composting include grass clippings, prunings, fruit and vegetable scraps, tea bags and coffee grounds. Brown ingredients include sticks, soil, cardboard, paper, eggshells and vacuum cleaner dust. It is best not to add materials such as raw or cooked meats, breads or pasta and baked goods, fatty foods or dairy products, as the pile can go smelly or attract vermin. If you are worried about spreading weeds, pop them in a black container in the sun for a few weeks to sterilise them. Composting is an aerobic process, so aeration is to ensure that the compost critters are getting enough oxygen. Loosen up the compost once or twice a week with a garden fork or compost turner. Compost also requires moisture. Keep the compost pile damp by either using a garden hose, the leftover water from cooking veggies, or from your coffee or teapot. Your compost should be about the dampness of a wrung-out sponge. You will also need to make sure that your compost bin receives some sunlight. Full sun in southeast Queensland can be a bit too much, so partly shaded areas are perfectly fine. If you're a committed composter and everything is working well, you can create finished compost in 6 to 8 weeks. For those casual composters, it might take up to 6 to 12 months. Once you've finished your compost, you can take the bin off the top of the pile and move the unfinished organic material back into the bin. Alternatively, you could just extract the amount of mature compost you require from the bottom of the pile and start using the compost around the garden. Finished compost can be used as a natural fertiliser and mixed into the soil in your garden or used as mulch. It can also go straight into pot plants. If you make a lot of organic waste, you may want to have 2 or more compost piles or bins at different stages of the composting process. So now that you've started your composting journey, you may run into some minor issues along the way. We will go through a few of the more common ones and how to correct them. healthy compost bin should smell earthy but not putrid or acidic. So try to avoid breads, fatty foods, meats or dairy, as these can become mouldy and rotten. Your compost may also be too wet. The simplest way to fix this is by adding some dry material like shredded paper, egg cartons, straw or dry leaves. If it was too wet, it might also have become compacted, so try aerating the material with a garden fork, shovel or compost turner. Compost, like soil, can vary in its natural acidity. A good way to test this is with a soil pH test kit. If your compost is turning acidic, less than a pH of 6, you can add something like wood ash, garden lime, or even crushed up eggshells to correct it. You should also review what is going into your compost and try to get a good ratio of green and brown materials to help neutralise the pH naturally. If you have unwanted critters in your compost, it might be that you have some of the things in there that they like to eat, like meats or cheese. Ensure you avoid putting in these items, as vermin can also attract snakes and other predators. Rats and mice can also make their home in a compost bin if it is too dry. Simply mix the compost with a fork or turner and add some moisture. That should deter them from coming back. Vinegar flies are after your exposed fruit. The easiest way to fix this is to stir your compost and cover the wet fruit with some dry brown ingredients. It is a good measure to put a bit of both ingredients in each time you add to your compost. If your compost is taking too long, it could be for a few reasons. Your compost might be in too much shade, so ensure that the bin is in the sun for part of the day. Full sun is not necessary unless you're in colder regions, but keep that in mind that your compost will slow down in the winter. Try adding some manure, comfrey or yarrow to help it get through this period. Your compost may also be too wet or too dry for it to process efficiently. Ensure that it is nicely balanced by seeing that it is damp but not saturated. If it is too wet, add some dry ingredients like sugarcane mulch and mix it through. If it is too dry, add some green ingredients and some moisture. Your compost might also not be getting enough air, and this could make it slow down, so keep it really well aerated by using a garden fork or compost turner. Remember that composting is not something that needs to be perfect. Trial and error are all part of the game. So happy composting, and if you'd like any more information, please visit the website.